The first thing my father said to me that night wasn't hello. It was, "You shouldn't be here." Not whispered. Not protective. Not concerned. Just firm. We were standing in the center of the Halston event hall, exposed brick walls, hanging Edison bulbs, a stage dressed in navy velvet with a gold-lettered banner that read, "Harrison Logistics, Launch Night." His last name. Not mine. Music hummed low through the speakers. Caterers floated between clusters of guests holding trays of champagne. I could smell cedarwood cologne and new carpet. He adjusted his cufflinks before looking at me again. "I told you," he said quietly, but not quietly enough. "This isn't the right environment." The right environment. I glanced around. Investors. Suppliers. 2 local council members. A handful of small business reporters. And standing near the bar, Ethan Cole. The investor. The one whose name had been whispered in our house for 6 months like a golden ticket. Ethan Cole, who had built and exited 2 distribution companies before turning 40. Ethan Cole, whose involvement meant my father's startup was suddenly credible. My father followed my gaze and shifted slightly, blocking my line of sight. "You're going to make this awkward," he added. I almost smiled. "I RSVP'd," I said calmly. "I know," he replied. I assumed that was a mistake. Behind him, a photographer lifted his camera. Flash. My father's smile snapped into place for the shot. Mine didn't. The humiliation wasn't loud. It never is. It's subtle. It's the way he introduced me 10 minutes later to a supplier as my daughter. She's figuring things out. I'm 32. I have a master's in supply chain analytics. I've spent 7 years managing distribution strategy for a national retailer. But tonight, in this room, I was figuring things out. I watched him shake hands. I watched him laugh at jokes that weren't funny. I watched him accept congratulations for a logistics framework I had built on his kitchen table at 11:48 p.m. 3 months ago. He never mentioned that part. When I approached him again near the stage, he was mid-conversation with Ethan Cole. Ethan's suit was charcoal. Impeccable tailoring. Silver watch. Observant eyes. "There she is," my father said before I could speak. "My daughter." She insisted on coming. Insisted. Ethan extended his hand politely. "Nice to meet you." His grip was steady. "You too," I said. "And what do you do?" he asked. There was the slightest pause. My father answered before I could. "She's exploring her options." Exploring. I held Ethan's gaze. "I design routing algorithms for mid-scale distribution networks," I said evenly. "Mostly focused on cost per mile reduction and warehouse flow optimization." A flicker in Ethan's eyes. Interest. My father laughed lightly. "She loves her spreadsheets." I didn't react. Ethan looked between us, something calculating behind his expression. "That's relevant," he said. "It's theoretical," my father corrected quickly. "This operation is hands-on. Relationships. Instinct. Instinct." I thought about the 42-page proposal I'd drafted. The supplier vetting matrix. The risk assessment spreadsheet color-coded by contingency tier. The ones he had emailed Ethan 2 weeks later as his own. The band music shifted to something louder. Applause rippled as someone announced the formal remarks were about to begin. My father squeezed my shoulder. After the speech, he murmured, leaning close, "Just stay in the background. Let the adults handle this. Let the adults." I nodded. I stepped back. And I watched him take the stage. He spoke confidently. Told the story of starting from nothing. Of grit. Of late nights sketching routes on yellow legal pads. Yellow legal pads. I almost admired the revisionist poetry of it. When he thanked Ethan publicly for believing in his vision, the room clapped enthusiastically. Not once did he mention partnership. Not once did he mention collaboration. Not once did he look at me. But then Ethan stood up. And instead of clapping, he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folder. Not a speech. A folder. "I'd like to say a few words," Ethan said, voice smooth but firm. My father's smile held. Confident. Expectant. Ethan stepped onto the stage beside him. "I invested in Harrison Logistics," he began, "because I was introduced to a strategic framework that impressed me." My father nodded slightly. Ethan opened the folder. And I'm here tonight, he continued, to finally meet the partner who built it. The room shifted. My father blinked once. Just once. And for the first time that evening, he didn't look at the audience. He looked at me. My father has always believed in timing. Not patience. Timing. He used to say, you don't swing at every pitch. You wait for the right one. But what he meant was, wait until it benefits you. Growing up, I learned quickly that visibility in our house was conditional. When I won the regional math competition in 10th grade, he framed the certificate and hung it in his office. Not because he was proud of the math, because it impressed clients. When I stayed up until 2:13 a.m. helping him rebuild a failed inventory spreadsheet for a hardware store contract he was chasing, he told the store owner, "I've got a good systems guy." Systems guy. Not my daughter. When I corrected an error in his projected freight margins, he had underestimated fuel volatility by nearly 8%. He patted my shoulder and said, "You've got a sharp eye." Then he presented the corrected numbers as instinct. Instinct. I was 24 when I moved back home briefly after graduate school. Not because I needed to. Because he asked. "I'm close to something big," he'd said over the phone. "I could use someone I trust." Trust. The word felt heavy then. It feels heavier now. He had this idea, a regional logistics company focused on last-mile distribution for small manufacturers. Lean overhead. Strategic routing. Tech-enabled tracking without bloated infrastructure. It wasn't a bad idea. It just wasn't fully formed. I built the bones of it over 6 weeks. Market analysis. Vendor comparison sheets. Warehouse location heat maps based on population density and highway access. I ran simulations at 1:07 a.m., 3:22 a.m., whenever the house was quiet enough for me to think. He would wander into the kitchen in the mornings, coffee in hand, and glance at my laptop screen. "Looks complicated," he'd say. "It doesn't have to be," I'd reply. He never once asked me to put my name on anything. And I never once asked him to. That's the part people misunderstand. It wasn't about credit back then. It was about building something together. Or at least, I thought it was. The first time I heard about Ethan Cole, it was accidental. I walked past my father's office and heard him on the phone. "Yes, the proprietary routing model is what sets us apart," he was saying. "I developed it after analyzing Midwest distribution inefficiencies for years." I stopped walking. Proprietary routing model. Developed it. Years. I stood there for maybe 6 seconds. Long enough to understand. Long enough to feel something shift. That night, at 11:46 p.m., I opened my laptop and started saving copies of everything. Email drafts. Version histories. Cloud backup logs. Timestamped file exports. Not because I planned to use them. Because I needed to see clearly. 2 weeks later, he asked if he could borrow my laptop for a presentation. His was acting up. I said yes. Of course I did. When he came home from that meeting, he was glowing. "He's interested," he said, dropping his keys on the counter. Real money. Real backing. "How much?" I asked. He hesitated just a fraction too long. Enough. That's when I knew. The next day, I checked my cloud access logs. A full download of the Harrison_logistics_master.xlsx file at 9:14 a.m. IP address. Downtown office building. Ethan Cole's office building. I didn't confront him. Not then. Instead, I asked one question. "When you structure this," I said casually over dinner, "how are you defining equity?" He didn't look up from his plate. "Founders' equity," he replied. "Standard split." "Founders," I repeated. He nodded. "You and Ethan?" "Of course." The fork in my hand felt heavier. "And the routing model?" I asked. "That's company property once we incorporate." "Company property. Not mine." I nodded slowly. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I simply opened a new folder on my desktop that night. Label, HL_archive. And I began documenting. Not emotional notes. Not journal entries. Data. Timestamps. Draft histories. Email attachments with embedded metadata showing original authorship. Even the screen recordings I had taken while walking him through the algorithm adjustments, dated, stored, backed up. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning clarity. Because if there's one thing I've learned about my father, it's this. He believes confidence overrides detail. That charm outpaces documentation. That presence wins rooms. And maybe it does. Until someone else has the paperwork. When he told me not to come to the launch, I almost didn't. But something in his tone, something too dismissive, too certain, made me RSVP yes. Not to disrupt. Not to embarrass. Just to observe. And when Ethan stepped onto that stage tonight and said he was there to finally meet the partner who built it, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Not vindication. Something quieter. Alignment. Because if Ethan was looking for a partner, then someone had been asking questions my father couldn't fully answer. And that meant the folder in Ethan's hand wasn't just ceremonial. It was investigative. My father had built this entire evening on the assumption that I would stay silent. That I would accept figuring things out. That I would stand in the background while he claimed instinct over infrastructure. He forgot one thing. I've never needed the spotlight. I just need the numbers. And Ethan Cole, standing on that stage, holding a folder he hadn't opened yet, was about to ask the one question my father couldn't improvise his way out of. The room didn't breathe. That's the only way I can describe it. Ethan stood beside my father under the warm stage lights, one hand resting on the folder, the other loosely holding the microphone. He wasn't smiling the way investors smile at launch parties. He wasn't performing. He was evaluating. I invested, he repeated calmly, because I reviewed a logistics model that demonstrated unusually precise route compression ratios. Sub 7% redundancy across multi-county lanes. A few people nodded politely, not fully understanding. I did. Because that ratio had taken me 11 iterations to achieve. My father shifted his weight slightly. Not nervous. Just adjusting. Ethan continued. The forecasting assumptions were conservative. Fuel variability stress-tested at 11.3%. Warehouse throughput simulations were layered with seasonal variants. He glanced sideways at my father, which is rare for a first-time founder. A faint ripple moved through the audience. My father's smile held, but it tightened at the edges. It took years of observation, he said smoothly into the mic. You refine instinct over time. Instinct. Ethan nodded slowly. Right, he said. Then he opened the folder. Not dramatically. Just deliberately. From where I stood near the back bar, I could see the first page. It wasn't a speech. It was a printout. Color-coded cells. Conditional formatting. My formatting. Ethan looked out over the room. I asked for the development history of this model, he said. Version logs. Draft progressions. Authorship metadata. My father's hand tightened around the mic, barely perceptible. And I received it. A pause. The kind that doesn't feel accidental. I always verify origin, Ethan continued. Not because I distrust people. Because I trust process. A small laugh from someone near the front. Nervous. Ethan flipped to the second page. File created, March 14th, 11:48 p.m. My chest tightened. Primary author. He stopped. Looked up. His eyes scanned the room. And landed on me. There it was again. Recognition. My father followed his gaze this time. Not subtly. Fully. The audience noticed. You could feel attention pivot. I didn't move. Didn't step forward. Didn't rescue him. Ethan spoke again. I was told the model evolved from years of proprietary field experience. He turned one more page. Yet the embedded revision history shows concentrated development over a 6-week period this spring. 87 documented edits. 93 optimization passes. A low murmur began. My father cleared his throat softly. Ethan, he said, tone light, we discussed collaborative input. Collaborative. Interesting choice. Ethan didn't look away from me. I asked a direct question during due diligence, he said. I asked who built it. The music in the background had stopped completely now. Even the catering staff stood still. And I was told, Ethan continued, that it was founder-developed. He closed the folder. Not slammed. Just closed. The sound was louder than it should have been. My father's voice shifted, just slightly. It was developed within the founding structure. Was it? Ethan asked. That was the first crack. Not accusation. Inquiry. My father's jaw flexed once. It was refined, he said carefully, with family input. Family input. The room tilted subtly toward me again. I felt 30 pairs of eyes measuring. Not pity. Curiosity. Ethan stepped away from the podium. One slow step. Before wiring capital, he said evenly, I ran an authorship trace through the file's metadata. My father's fingers tightened around the microphone. The originating profile, Ethan continued, belongs to someone whose name is not listed on the incorporation documents. The silence this time wasn't dense. It was sharp. And my father understood something in that moment. This wasn't a ceremonial acknowledgement. This was a correction. Ethan turned fully toward me now. Would you join us up here? He asked. The request wasn't loud, but it carried. My father's face went still. Not angry. Not panicked. Calculating. He was trying to assess how much Ethan knew. How much I would say. How much control he still had. I set my glass down carefully on the bar. The condensation left a faint ring on the wood. I smoothed the front of my dress, not out of nerves, but habit. Then I walked forward. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Just measured. Each step felt deliberate against the polished concrete floor. When I reached the stage, my father leaned toward me slightly. You don't have to do this, he murmured. I looked at him. For once, I said quietly, I think I do. Ethan extended the microphone toward me. The room was waiting. My father's entire narrative balanced on the next sentence. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what I was about to say. The microphone was heavier than I expected. Not physically. Symbolically. I didn't take it right away. I looked at my father first. Up close, under the stage lights, I could see the faint crease forming between his brows. Not fear. Not yet. Just recalibration. He was running scenarios in his head, how to redirect, how to charm, how to reframe this as a touching father-daughter collaboration story. He was very good at that. Ethan kept the microphone extended, patient. I'm not here to undermine anyone, I said finally, accepting it. My voice didn't shake. I made sure of that. I'm here because clarity matters when capital is involved. A few heads nodded instinctively. Investors understand that language. I turned slightly so I wasn't facing only my father. This model, I continued, was built over 6 weeks. It started as a basic routing compression sheet. It evolved into a multi-layered forecasting system after stress testing fuel volatility and warehouse throughput under seasonal variance. Ethan's eyes flickered with something like affirmation. I drafted the first version on March 14th at 11:48 p.m., I said. The file history reflects 87 major edits and 93 optimization passes. I can provide the raw development logs if needed. The room had gone from curious to attentive. Not dramatic. Analytical. My father stepped closer to the mic attached to the podium. We worked on it together, he said, tone warm again. She's always been brilliant with numbers. I provided the industry insight. It was a graceful pivot. Inclusive. Harmless. Almost believable. I didn't contradict him immediately. Silence is more effective than interruption. Yes, I said after a measured pause. You explained the operational constraints. I translated them into a scalable framework. That subtle shift in phrasing changed the architecture of the story. He wasn't the architect. He was the source material. A few people in the front exchanged glances. Ethan folded his hands loosely. I asked during due diligence, he said calmly, whether there were any unrecognized contributors to the intellectual property. My father smiled lightly. And I clarified that family discussions helped refine the thinking. Refinement, Ethan repeated. He reached into the folder again. This time he pulled out a single printed page. An email. Projected onto the screen behind us. I hadn't known he would do that. But when I saw the subject line, HL_model_final_V6, I recognized it instantly. Sent from my father's email. To Ethan. 2 weeks ago. Attached file. Harrison_logistics_master.xlsx. No CC. No mention of collaboration. Just one sentence in the body. Here's the proprietary model I developed that gives us our competitive edge. The room shifted audibly. It wasn't gasps. It was the quiet friction of belief adjusting. My father's smile disappeared. Only slightly. That's just shorthand, he said quickly. In business correspondence, you don't. You don't what? Ethan asked evenly. My father's jaw tightened. Complicate messaging, he replied. Ethan nodded slowly. I don't mind simplified messaging, he said. I mind misrepresented origin. There it was. Not accusation. Precision. I handed the microphone back to Ethan. I'm not seeking public credit, I said calmly. I'm seeking formal acknowledgement and defined equity if my work underpins the valuation. The word equity hung in the air like a contract waiting to be signed. My father looked at me fully now. No performance. No audience management. Just calculation and something else. Realization. You're asking for ownership, he said quietly. I'm asking for accuracy, I replied. Behind us, the banner with his name stretched across the velvet backdrop. Harrison Logistics. Only one name. Ethan turned to the audience. For transparency, he said, my investment term sheet includes intellectual property clauses. If foundational assets are co-developed, equity structures must reflect that. Murmurs again. Not scandalized. Reassessing. My father straightened. You're turning a launch party into a negotiation, he said, voice controlled but thinner now. No, I answered softly. You did that when you removed my name. Silence. A photographer near the stage lowered his camera completely. No one wanted a staged smile anymore. Ethan stepped slightly aside, giving space without surrendering presence. Let's be clear, he said. If the model was misrepresented during due diligence, that affects valuation integrity. Valuation integrity. That phrase landed harder than anything else. Because now it wasn't about family tension. It was about numbers. My father knew numbers. He understood risk. The room felt different now, less celebratory, more clinical. Investors don't panic. They recalculate. And I could see it happening in real time. My father looked at the crowd, then back at Ethan, then at me. For years, he had believed I would protect him. That I would stay quiet to preserve image. That loyalty meant invisibility. He was realizing that loyalty without recognition is just extraction. I never intended to exclude you, he said finally. It sounded almost sincere. But you did, I replied. Another pause. Ethan closed the folder completely this time. I suggest, he said evenly, we adjourn the celebration and reconvene privately to amend structure before capital deployment continues. That sentence carried more weight than applause ever could. Because capital hadn't fully deployed yet. Which meant the deal wasn't sealed. Which meant my father's control wasn't guaranteed. The banner behind us suddenly looked premature. My father exhaled slowly. And for the first time since I was a child watching him pitch contracts at our dining table, he didn't have the room.